This is a very special interaction we are having on Outlook 2024 with someone who's very good in macros, and we really respect his thoughts, and that is Neelkanth Mishra of Axis Capital, Axis Bank. Neelkanth, wonderful to have you, and I see that your report talks about a positive surprise as far as growth, India growth is concerned. In fact, it's not just you. RBI Governor too this time around raised the outlook on GDP growth. And why not? The last reading on quarterly GDP was a big surprise. What are the elements of this outperformance on growth which you are actually talking about going forward?
So there are three major points here. The first is that I think the capital injection slowdown, or rather the slowdown in capital formation that happened pre-COVID has already brought down trend growth assumptions. And that was, I think, a mistake. Most people thought that this means that India's economy is no longer capable of growing even at 7%, that it should be more like 6.5%. And then the second change that happened was that people thought that the COVID-related recession, or rather the growth problems that India faced or the rest of the world faced, that this would lead to a further reduction, so that what was 6.5% trend growth would become even lower going forward. And the third was that the recovery in this capital cycle is something that was seen as coming in much later, and it is starting to become visible now. So on all three fronts, there are reasons to be more constructive. The first is that the slowdown that occurred was because there was a prolonged adjustment in the real estate cycle. There was a prolonged cleanup of balance sheets on the private corporate side. And so both the household sector and the private corporate sector, capital formation is starting to do much better now. And therefore, perhaps the trend growth numbers have been brought down too much and they need to be pumped up. The scarring from COVID. So COVID was a recession which was unlike every other recession we've seen in the past, where we forced people to stay at home and then we asked them to move around. And the scarring from that was not that permanent. And the third is that now there is clear evidence that the turn in the capital injection cycle has become visible. So now we are seeing cement volume growth pick up. We are starting to see early signs of shortages in the power generation sector. So which gives us some comfort that trend growth, as we think about the next 5 years, is going to be well above 7%. So those are the reasons why we think growth numbers will be upgraded.
Trend growth for the next 5 years above 7% is very good news for the markets as well. But the other point I want to scratch with you is on inflation. This policy commentary, we did see RBI Governor also talking about almost 4.2% kind of inflation reading possibilities by Q3 of next year. Where do you see this trend and inflation? Do you think that monster is completely captured now and the fear is kind of easing of inflation higher for longer?
No, so we need to be cautious at all times. I think premature celebration is something that I've always warned against, wherein that if you have to sustain a stable and strong growth rate for the next 25, 30 years, which is a narrow window in which India needs to do well to become rich, we need to manage both inflation and growth and calibrate the policies very adeptly. The reason why core inflation is easing and it is now below where it was pre-pandemic is that despite our growth surprises, we are still, I would say, 1.2, 1.3 years of growth behind where we would have been if the COVID pandemic had not happened. So which means that there is surplus labor, there is surplus capacity in the economy, and which is what keeping core inflation low. One of the reasons why I think the RBI may not find room to cut next year is the fact that food inflation is likely to remain quite volatile. The expectation of a 4.5 handle about a year later is, I think, a reasonable one to have, because food inflation also over a period of time, if if the core is stable and the demand for food is not really shooting up and supply is not getting permanently disrupted, should also settle down at a certain point. But remember that that will not be enough for the RBI or the MPC to start cutting rates, because remember that their objective or their target is 4 plus minus 2%. So unless there is a path that inflation is going to sustainably start falling below 4, it's going to be very hard for the RBI to start cutting rates.
Neelkanth, what are your thoughts on capital flows in the light of the environment which you are painting for us going forward? If India does have superior growth versus the world, do you see capital flows coming back? Because FIs have actually pulled out quite meaningful sum in the last few quarters. Of course, domestics were active, but do you see flows from FIs also reverse in this light?
So in this discussion, the US fiscal and monetary policy preferences become very important. So one of the reasons why we have seen the US economy ward off recession in 2023 has been the fact that their fiscal deficit almost doubled year on year. And so if you have 7 to 8% fiscal deficit and then a 3.5-4% increase in fiscal deficit year on year, it is very hard to trigger a recession. And this is happening in an environment where there is quantitative tightening. So as we highlight in our outlook note, the money in dollar terms is shrinking at around 3.5% a year currently.